message came just as I was organizing a forgotten stack of galleys near the window. Its light filtered through the dusty blinds like old film stock. Soft and trembling. It read, "Mr. Caspian Devereaux has passed away. As per his will, his private library is bequeathed to you." There was no fanfare, no condolences, just a statement. Sharp as a paper cut, severing the mundane flow of my day. Caspian, a name like a half-remembered poem, whispered through the hallways of memory. He was my father's brother, a man who rarely visited. And when he did, he stood in the corner like a portrait too old to dust, speaking little, observing much, cloaked in the kind of silence that draws more questions than it answers. At home. His name was a silence, an absence dressed in wool coats and mahogany scent. Yet here he was, returning not in flesh, but in books and shadows. And somehow, I felt the chill of unfinished business pressing against my spine. That evening, I brewed tea without really tasting it, my thoughts thudding like slow footsteps in a long corridor. I stared at the shelves in my apartment, the worn spines, the dog-eared pages, the annotations in margins like murmured prayers. I have always been drawn to incompleteness, to stories that fade mid-sentence, as if the author simply vanished into air without warning or apology. Perhaps that's why I became an editor, to listen for echoes in the quiet, to give endings to those who were denied them. My father, Magnus, never spoke of his childhood. He preferred books to people, and silence to explanation. He often vanished into his study for hours, emerging only when the house had emptied of noise and the day had folded into its own quiet dusk. And my mother, Solara, moved through life like a painter blind to her own palette, serene, distant. Her eyes occasionally clouded by memories that didn't belong to the room she stood in. I should have asked more, pressed more, reached deeper into the folds of their reticence, but I was taught that silence was a form of grace, that not asking was a way of loving without intrusion. Now I wonder if what we called peace was simply a well-practiced denial, dressed in civility and linen. The next day, I took the train to the address listed in the will, a town just far enough to feel forgotten, just old enough to smell like autumn even in spring. The house was more library than home, tall windows, books stacked like fortresses, corridors dimly lit by lamps that hummed softly, as if reluctant to disturb the dust or the dreams it sheltered. There, in the corner of a locked cabinet, I found it, a manuscript, no title, no author. The cover was worn, the pages stained, but the handwriting on the margins, I knew that hand. My father's. The same looping, precise script that once corrected my grammar in childhood essays now danced beside paragraphs filled with sorrow, longing, and something darker, like a confession never meant to be heard aloud. Beside it, a faded photograph, a woman, not more than 25, her expression half-lit, as if caught between laughter and despair. Her face, it mirrored mine with haunting precision, like a version of myself paused in a different life, and tucked beneath that image, a silver necklace with a rose engraved on its pendant, delicate, unassuming, and completely unfamiliar, yet pulsing with a strange, invisible gravity. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe fully. It felt as though the room itself had paused, holding its breath with me, suspended between two heartbeats, and I, the daughter of a man wrapped in silence, found myself standing at the edge of a story I hadn't known I was part of. I always believed my life was a novel well bound, the chapters closed, the themes resolved. But now, a page, unnumbered, forgotten, had drifted into my hands, and everything I thought I'd finished had begun again. The room had no clocks, yet time throbbed against my temples like a second heartbeat. I stood before the manuscript as if it were a mirror covered in dust, one I had never dared to wipe clean until now. The paper was brittle, yellowed like teeth that had clenched through generations of silence, and the ink bled through its fibers in delicate fractures, as though the words themselves had suffered 1,000 winters of withholding. I opened it slowly, afraid it might disintegrate in my hands, not from age, but from memory, as if the story it held resisted being seen again. It began in the soft cadence of a literary fiction piece, elegant and melancholic. But there was an undercurrent of something unresolved, like the moment just before lightning strikes. The story told of a family shattered by a name never spoken, of a woman who vanished without a trace, and a child whose life was reshaped by the hands of those who had no right to remold it. But it wasn't just the narrative that arrested me, it was the margins. My father's handwriting, unmistakable, traced the edges of paragraphs like a silent dialogue with pain. He had annotated the text not like an editor, but like someone in mourning, each note carrying the fragile weight of what couldn't be said out loud. Some comments were factual, questioning logic or word choice, but others trembled with memory, with guilt, with a yearning that felt so private I almost looked away. One note, beside a passage describing the moment the mother disappears into a forest at dusk. Simply read, "She never made it out." 4 words that thundered inside me like a secret long buried under floorboards, finally echoing back up through wood and bone, unraveling the fragile balance between my breath and understanding. My hands shook, not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't a novel. It was a wound, disguised as fiction, dressed in the syntax of grief. Beneath the manuscript's final page, there was no ending. No resolution, just a blank space stained with a faint smudge of ink, as though the pen had hovered there, hesitated, and then stopped, as if it were holding its breath too long, a breath never exhaled, a goodbye never granted the dignity of sound. That absence rang louder than any conclusion, a deliberate silence, screaming to be understood, begging to be mourned. I turned back to the photograph, holding it closer now, as though proximity might reveal an answer. Her eyes, my eyes, stared back with a question neither of us could voice, locked in a gaze that felt both ancient and immediate. She was young, not naive, but tired in the way only those who have lost their story halfway through can be, as if the ending was taken before it could be written. And that necklace, the rose, engraved silver, felt less like an ornament now and more like a token passed between lives, a marker for something sacred and broken, worn and remembered. The room around me felt colder, though the windows remained shut, and no draft stirred. Shadows stretched where they hadn't before, and every creak in the wooden floorboards beneath my feet felt like the sigh of a house long denied the right to speak, each sound a soft protest against years of silence. I sat down, slowly, and let the manuscript rest on my knees, open to its blank page, as if waiting for me to finish what had been started by grief, what had been interrupted by love undone. And in that stillness, a truth formed, not complete, not yet spoken, but present like the outline of a shape beneath linen. My father hadn't written a story. He had preserved a confession, sealed in metaphor and ink, and I, unknowingly, had stepped into its wake, inheriting not only pages, but the breath he had held while writing them. I didn't know what to do with that weight, but I knew this much. Nothing in my life had ever been fiction. Not really. And now, nothing could remain buried. Not after this. I closed the manuscript, gently, as though tucking in a child who had cried too long, whose dreams had finally softened into rest, and somewhere in the back of my mind. The silence whispered again. This was never just a story. It was a mirror. And I was never just a daughter reading a book, but a question waiting to be answered. There are moments when silence arrives, not as peace, but as a shadow so thick it swallows the air around every breath. I stood in the hallway of our home, manuscript hidden beneath my coat, the photograph and necklace pressed close to my chest like relics from a dream I couldn't quite explain. And the weight of them made my heartbeat echo louder than the ticking in the walls. The house hummed with its usual stillness, but that day, it felt like something was listening, a kind of quiet that waits for a truth too heavy to hold without trembling. My father was in his study, the door slightly ajar, as it always was when he didn't want company, but hadn't the heart to say so. The smell of ink and old leather drifted through the gap, and I stepped in slowly, as though crossing into another century or stepping barefoot onto a page not meant to be read aloud. He looked up from his desk, his glasses perched low, eyes soft with the wear of knowledge and distance accumulated over a lifetime of silence. I said his name once, a sound barely above a whisper. Then I placed the manuscript on the table between us. No preamble, no explanation, only the weight of the object speaking for itself, as though its presence alone could collapse the architecture of his restraint. At first, he didn't move. He stared at it as though it were an apparition, something conjured by the very past he thought he had buried beneath layers of scholarship and routine. Then his hand trembled, not reaching for it, but curling away, as though its proximity scorched more than fire ever could. His voice came like a fracture in stone, low, broken, defensive. "Where did you get this?" Not spoken with curiosity, but with a fear wearing the mask of anger. I said nothing, only opened the manuscript to the annotated page, letting the shape of his handwriting accuse him in ways I never could, allowing the ink to speak what his mouth had always refused. His breath stilled, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was the clock he refused to hang, ticking now, as if it too had waited for this reckoning with time. Then he snapped the book shut with such force it felt like a door slamming on an entire lifetime of deflection. "This isn't for you," he said, voice sharper now, brittle and shaking, unraveling thread by thread. "It was never meant to be found." I told him about the library, about Caspian's will, about the photograph that mirrored my face in another life. But he wasn't listening. His hands searched for the pages as if to rip them apart, to erase what had already been lived, already been written into the marrow of us. My mother arrived in the doorway, her eyes widening with a pain that bloomed without sound. Like a flower pressed shut for too long, she stepped forward, gently placing her hand over his. "It's time," she whispered, voice thin but steady. But he pulled away, retreating behind a wall built of books and grief and unspoken years. I watched the man I had revered collapse into the boy he must have once been, terrified, cornered, clutching secrets like a drowning man clutches breath not because he wants to breathe, but because he doesn't know how to let go. And in that unraveling, something inside me shifted. I no longer feared the truth. I feared the weight of its absence, the hollowness it left behind. Afterwards, he locked himself in the study for hours, as if silence could rewind what had already been said. My mother said nothing, only sat beside me in the living room, her fingers tracing the necklace now resting in my palm as if remembering a pulse long gone. She didn't ask what I would do next. She knew that I had already crossed the threshold from ignorance into knowing, from story into blood. I held the manuscript that night, not as a relic, but as a key carved from silence. I had been raised in a house where silence was dressed as serenity, where questions were tucked beneath politeness like blades beneath linen napkins, concealed but always capable of cutting. But now, I knew better. Some truths arrive wrapped in violence, not of action, but of memory and withheld breath, and when I closed my eyes, I didn't see my father's face. I saw hers, the woman in the photograph, the reflection I couldn't unsee, whose existence trembled just beneath mine, and I knew this was only the beginning of a story that had never been mine alone. The wall had cracked, and something had started to leak through, not as flood, but as a slow undoing, as truth finally allowed to breathe. The city moved outside my window like a memory refusing to settle. All light and noise and blurred outlines of lives I didn't recognize as mine. I sat with the necklace in my hand, its weight strangely constant, as though the metal remembered what I had only begun to suspect. Whispering truths in the language of quiet persistence. The manuscript lay open beside me, not for reading, but as a presence, as something that listened without interrupting, holding the silence between questions I hadn't dared to shape into words. There are thresholds one does not realize have been crossed until the return becomes impossible. And I had crossed mine without fanfare, without even noticing the precise moment I stopped being a daughter and became a seeker. That week, I found myself walking through New York with a different cadence, slower, as though the streets carried secrets under their pavement and I had finally learned how to listen. Every glance, every stranger's silhouette, seemed to echo some hidden lineage I had never been told. And I began to wonder, how many stories had I edited? How many texts had I resurrected? While my own narrative lay buried beneath the dust of omission. I ordered the DNA test as one might light a candle in a room that had remained dark for decades, not in certainty, but in need, in hunger, in the ache of not knowing where your blood begins. I took samples from myself and then from my father's belongings, a toothbrush, a comb, remnants of his daily presence that now felt sacred in their banality. Relics of routine now transformed into instruments of revelation. The kit came with sterile instructions, but my hands trembled as though they held an ancient artifact rather than cotton swabs, as though I was preparing not for science, but for confession. I sealed the envelope as one might seal a confession, knowing that truth had its own gravitational pull, and that, once set in motion, some answers refuse to remain hypothetical. No matter how tightly you try to close the box. At the clinic, everything was clean and indifferent. A temple of modern knowing that asked no questions and offered no comfort. The receptionist smiled with a practiced warmth, her tone calibrated to avoid any acknowledgement of what people came there seeking, truths shaped like absences. The waiting room was quiet. The kind of quiet that amplifies your thoughts until they throb in your chest like a second heartbeat you didn't know you had. The walls were pale, almost too pale, and I couldn't help but think the light there had been designed not to comfort but to expose, not to heal, but to reveal. When the technician took the envelope from my hand, I almost asked if they had ever opened a letter that changed someone's life, if their hands ever trembled, knowing what they were holding. But I didn't. Some questions are not meant for strangers. Not because they wouldn't understand, but because their answers require the silence of someone who already knows what's coming, who already hears the echo before the voice has spoken. I left the building with the same steps I had entered, but everything beneath my skin felt rearranged, like a mosaic coming undone before being reassembled into something irreversibly different, painfully honest. That night, I dreamt of the woman in the photograph, not as a ghost, not as fiction, but as someone breathing in the space just beside mine, her hands reaching, Not for me, but for a truth that had once belonged to her, and now asked to be remembered by me. I woke with the feeling of her presence still in the room, and for a brief moment, the air smelled like pages too long unopened, like stories finally ready to be told with trembling ink. Her silence didn't frighten me anymore. It invited me. I didn't tell my parents about the test. Not yet. Some silences must be allowed to linger just a while longer. Not out of fear, but because once shattered, they do not rebuild. They transform. They demand new architecture. I wrote in my journal that night, I am not searching for betrayal. I am searching for alignment between who I was told I am and who I have always felt myself to be. Between name and essence, and when truth beckons. Even silence has to move, not with force, but with gravity that nothing in you can resist. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday, wrapped in the kind of stillness that seems too precise to be coincidence. I held it in my hands longer than necessary, running my thumb along the seam as if the paper could speak before I opened it, as though it might whisper a softer truth than the one sealed inside. It felt heavier than paper ought to feel, like a chamber holding not just data, but the tectonic plates of identity waiting to shift beneath my feet. The clinic's logo was small, discreet, yet it seemed to burn against the white like a brand placed over silence that had gone on too long, like a seal pressed into a secret too long buried. I didn't open it immediately, because some moments ask not for speed, but for reverence. I placed it on the table next to my tea, let the steam cloud the envelope's edges, and watched as time tried to fold itself around the moment and delay what was already inevitable, as if the minutes themselves were reluctant to carry what I was about to learn. The room was quiet, save for the slow tick of a clock that hadn't mattered until now, and I could hear the echo of my own breath, tight, shallow, rehearsed like lines from a play I never meant to perform. When I finally tore the flap open, it felt like the sound echoed through the walls, like the house itself paused to listen, as though even its bones recognized what had been summoned. Inside, the paper was smooth and indifferent, a sterile vessel for something far from emotionless. There was no drama in the lines, only data, only facts. Yet those sterile truths struck louder than screams. But the moment my eyes met the printed words, something wordless inside me tilted, as if gravity itself had been rewritten. The technician's summary was concise. No paternal match identified between subject Coraline Devereaux and Magnus Devereaux. Beneath it, a second line, smaller and more devastating. Genetic marker linked to Serafina Lyra confirmed maternal match. The paper slipped from my hand, landing on the hardwood floor with the softness of something final. Not with violence, but with the weight of a truth that had waited too long. I couldn't pick it up right away, because my knees weakened, not from shock, but from the gravity of what had finally taken shape. Magnus wasn't my father, not by blood, not by origin. And the woman in the photograph wasn't just a ghost of resemblance. She was my mother. Not in theory, but in the precise sequence of my cells, written into the very script of my being. My throat tightened with the silence of 1,000 unasked questions that now crowded the corners of the room. Who was the man who had written lullabies into margins, who had corrected my essays, taught me to hold a teacup with elegance, to read subtext like scripture, to understand silence as a second language? And if he had not given me my blood, what had he given me instead? An inheritance of care stitched together from guilt and longing, a devotion carved from sorrow? I did not cry, because the tears hovered, polite and withheld, as though even they understood the solemnity of this moment, as though this discovery required stillness rather than collapse. I walked to the mirror, stared at my own face, not for vanity, but for lineage, for recognition. The arch of the brow, the angle of the jaw, the weight behind the eyes. I searched for Serafina there, and to my surprise, I found her, not just in the cheekbones or the curve of the chin, but in the gaze that looked back at me, a gaze no longer asking for truth, but holding it like a birthright. I sat down slowly, and for the first time in years, I felt unmoored, not lost, but floating in a space where all the anchors I had known had been gently lifted, where certainty had been replaced by something more tender, clarity. I picked up the page again, this time without fear or trembling, and as I read the confirmation of what had always lived beneath my skin, I realized something quiet but absolute. Truth doesn't break you. It rearranges you, and if you let it, it reveals the blueprint that had always been written beneath your ribs, waiting for breath. The room felt different after that, no longer a chamber of doubt, but a space cleared by revelation. It wasn't colder, nor was it emptier. It was simply, and irrevocably, honest. And in that honesty, I breathed differently, not because I was free from pain or confusion, but because now, I finally knew what I had inherited, not a name or a narrative pre-written, but a story that had waited to be returned, not to history, but to me. Grief does not always announce itself with wailing or collapse. Sometimes, it arrives in quiet rituals, like warming the same cup of tea twice without drinking it, or opening a book to the same page you cannot finish, or walking past a mirror you no longer recognize as bearing your face. In the days after the DNA results, I found myself suspended in this quiet grief, not weeping, not lost, but wrapped in a silence that seemed to carry the shape of something broken, being gently rearranged into a form both unfamiliar and deeply known. I began spending more time alone, not out of avoidance, but out of necessity, as though solitude had become the only space honest enough to hold the weight of what I now knew without collapsing under it. The apartment became a sanctuary, not of healing yet, but of recognition, a place where stillness no longer felt empty, but sacred. Each object carried a new context, my father's books no longer merely academic, but now seen as the landscape of a man who raised a child not of his blood, but of his burden and devotion, with hands that trembled not from age, but from memory. The walls, the photographs, even the silence between footsteps, all of it hummed with the echo of choices made in fear and in love, stitched together with intention and the soft thread of unspoken sacrifice. One afternoon, I found my mother in the kitchen, quietly slicing pears with a rhythm that felt older than time. The light fell across her hands in a way that made her seem older and softer, not diminished, but transparent, as though her sorrow had made her translucent and glowing from within. I placed the DNA envelope on the table, and though she did not open it, her eyes met mine with a knowing that had long predated my questions, as if she had been waiting for this moment, not fearing it. We did not speak at first, and the silence was not avoidance. It was ceremony, a sacred pause before language returned. Then she reached for my hand, not to explain, but to anchor us in the present. Her voice, when it came, trembled not with fear, but with memory unfolding after years of silence. She told me of Serafina, not the myth, not the name whispered through regret, but the woman she had known, a luminous, impulsive artist with too much tenderness in her eyes and too little time in the world, whose absence still left fingerprints on everything she touched. My mother had loved her, not as a rival, but as a friend, and when Serafina died giving birth to me, It was she who wrapped my body in a cotton shawl and whispered promises over a cradle that was never supposed to be hers, but became hers by choice, not by obligation. My father, she said, had shattered in private, quietly and irreversibly. He could not grieve openly, not in a family where lineage was law and deviation a betrayal of everything sacred. So he wrote, not memoirs, not eulogies, but manuscripts, half-fictionalized apologies to a woman he lost and a daughter he was never meant to raise. My mother read every one, not to edit, but to witness, to hold space for a man whose silence had become his pen. And then she chose to stay, not for duty, but for love. Love for the child who carried the silence of two women inside her, and for a man who mourned through paragraphs instead of prayers. That night, I returned to the manuscript, not as a question, but as a continuation of something that had begun long before me. I began to write, not to fix what had been left undone, but to honor it, to meet it where it had stopped. Each sentence came slowly, not as invention, but as excavation, as if I were uncovering a life written beneath the surface of mine. I wrote Serafina as I imagined she had lived, in colors, in contradictions, in grace that never asked to be perfect. And I wrote my father, not as the liar I once feared, but as a man who had carried a secret so large it rewrote his life into shadows and margins. I did not seek to justify. I sought to understand. In that act, something shifted within me. The grief did not vanish into light, but it acquired shape, like a mosaic of shattered glass reassembled into something not whole, but illuminated with purpose. Healing, I realized, is not the removal of pain. It is the restoration of meaning where rupture once lived, and where memory had splintered into silence, and in that restored space. I found my breath again, not as a gasp, but as a return, quiet and resolute, not to who I was, but to who I could now begin to become. Some letters are never meant to be sent, not because their truths are unworthy, but because their meaning lives in the act of writing, not in the act of delivery. I found myself returning to Serafina in silence, not through voices or photographs, but through the movement of pen across paper, as though the ink itself remembered the shape of her absence before I could articulate it. It began as a whisper of thought, barely formed, then slowly unwound into sentences that trembled with the weight of what could never be answered, what could only be acknowledged in stillness. I wrote to her not as a stranger, not as a daughter searching for lineage, but as someone suspended between longing and understanding. Someone whose questions had become softer now that they were carried with context and colored by compassion. You are the beginning of everything I never knew I was, I wrote. And in your disappearance, you left me a map drawn in silence, folded in the breath of those who loved you too quietly to speak aloud. I imagined her reading those lines in a room without clocks, in a time where pain had no edges, only the endless motion of memory brushing past the living, like a tide returning with nothing but names. There were moments when the writing faltered, not from lack of emotion, but from the sheer complexity of holding a grief that was both inherited and self-born, both intimate and mythic. She had been gone all my life, yet her echo had guided my hands in every editorial decision, in every margin I filled with suggestion, in every broken sentence I longed to complete but never fully understood. How strange it was to realize that the woman I had been seeking through fiction was not a character, but a mother, a presence that had carved its shape into my instinct without ever speaking a word, without ever standing in a frame. I did not ask for forgiveness in that letter, nor did I offer it, because there was no debt between us. There was no need. What lived between us was not regret, but recognition. That silent space where stories meet their origin and do not flinch. Where truth breathes without being named. I told her about Magnus, not as the man who withheld, but as the man who held on through pages instead of promises. I told her about Solara, not as the woman who replaced her, but as the one who preserved what was fragile and kept it from vanishing into the noise of a world that forgets too easily. I wrote about the manuscript, the necklace, the photograph, all the relics that had stitched together a history too sacred for exposition, too full for simplification. And I thanked her, not for giving me life, but for giving me the mystery that would become my compass, the silence that would shape my voice. Because it was in the unraveling that I found direction, in the dissonance that I found music, in the ambiguity that I found meaning. Her absence had not left me empty. It had left me open, expansive in ways certainty could never teach. By the time I finished the letter, the light had shifted on the floorboards, stretching long like shadows of questions no longer afraid of being unanswered or misunderstood. I did not fold the letter. I did not seal it. I placed it inside the manuscript, between the pages where her name was last written, and closed the cover as gently as if I were closing a door that no longer needed to be forced open, only honored. Some letters, I realized, are not meant for postage. They are meant for return, to the place within us that still waits, still listens, still believes, even in silence, to the ones we write toward, even when they are gone. Time does not mend all things. It only allows the broken to grow edges soft enough to touch without bleeding. In the days that followed the unsent letter, life returned with neither fanfare nor defiance, but with the quiet rhythm of a clock whose ticking had never truly stopped, only fallen beneath the threshold of my hearing. I moved through the apartment as one might through a museum built from their own memories. Every book, every chair, every window holding a fragment of something once known and now redefined. Magnus sat by the window more often, not reading, not writing, just holding a cup of tea that never seemed to cool, as if the heat it carried came from something deeper than liquid. There was a hush between us, not cold, not strained, but sacred, like a truce signed not with words but with breath, with presence. He once looked up from his seat and, in a voice barely above the sound of fabric brushing skin, said that he had named me Coraline not for the sea, but for the stone, resilient, rare, formed in pressure. And I carried that with me, not as an apology, but as a benediction. Solara returned to painting, and though the images she now created were no less abstract than before, I could feel a shift in their texture, less concealment, more conversation. Her brush no longer erased pain with color, but layered it into meaning, allowing the shadows to remain as long as they danced with light. She once left a canvas by my door, a muted horizon pierced by a single bloom of deep red, and though no words accompanied it, I knew it was the rose from the necklace, reimagined not as a relic, but as a seed of continuity, in that space between acceptance and memory. I finished the manuscript. I did not revise it as an editor would, hunting errors or tightening prose. Instead, I moved through it as one tends to a grave, delicately, reverently, leaving parts untouched because some silences should not be filled. I added only what was necessary, a preface, signed not with my name, but with a symbol of her initials entwined, as though Serafina had written through me, not been written about. We published it under Magnus's name, at his request, and though the world would never know the story behind the story, I did not feel robbed of truth, because truth, I had learned, is not always a matter of exposure, It is often a matter of intention, and in that intention, we had all found peace. The book was read, quoted, passed along, and in each hand it touched. I imagined a breath, one that had been held for too long, being finally, gently released. Sometimes I still return to the attic of Caspian's library, not for answers, but for stillness. There, surrounded by the scent of paper and dust, I remembered not the revelation, but the beginning, the moment when I first touched the cover of a manuscript and felt it pulse like a living thing. That memory, more than the truth itself, stayed with me. Because it was not the secret that shaped me, it was the search. And on certain evenings, we would sit together, the three of us, in the warm hush of the library, each holding a different kind of silence. Magnus with his unread book, Solara with her sketchpad resting idle, and I, with my fingers tracing the rim of a ceramic mug I had crafted, imperfect and glazed with cracks, but whole in its own right, still bearing the weight of everything unspoken yet accepted. We did not speak of the past, but we held it, and somehow, in that act alone, it began to belong to all of us, not as burden, but as memory made whole. There was no announcement, no dramatic unveiling, just a quiet ripple of curiosity when the manuscript entered the world, not as a revelation, but as a restoration of something nearly lost. We let it speak for itself, untethered by explanation, because some stories do not need context to breathe, they only need space and time, and readers who are willing to listen with more than just their eyes. The cover bore his name, but the story carried all of ours, folded into its pages like pressed flowers, preserved not for perfection, but for the truth they once held. I wrote the preface without ornament, without self-reference, just a note about how stories, when left unfinished, often find their own endings through the people who inherit them. I didn't expect anyone to notice the embedded symbols, or the subtle references, yet I hoped that someone, somewhere, might pause on a phrase and feel the resonance of a voice that had waited decades to be heard. There was no marketing campaign, no tour, no interviews, only shelves, only silence, and eventually, letters, small notes from strangers who spoke not of plot, but of memory, of how the manuscript had echoed something quiet within them. Magnus never asked about the reception. I think he feared it, not because of judgment, but because praise would make the loss feel louder, and critique would reduce it to artifice, instead. He read the book again as a reader this time, not a father, not a penitent, but simply as a man who had once loved, and lost, and dared to remember. He closed it once, exhaled, and whispered into the stillness, saying softly that it finally sounded like her, and that was all he needed. Solara stood beside him when he said it. She didn't cry, and she didn't smile. She simply placed her hand on his, not to comfort, but to share the gravity of a moment that didn't need translation. And somehow that small gesture was louder than words could ever be. It was enough. And in the weeks after, they spoke more often, not in confessions, but in fragments of daily life, the kind that say, "We are here now," without needing to say more. And perhaps that was where healing quietly began. As for me, I did not go back to who I was before, nor did I become someone new. I remained in the threshold, the space between what is inherited and what is chosen, and that place, once haunted, became inhabitable. I curated other manuscripts, listened to other voices, but every now and then, when alone with an old draft or a flawed sentence, I would think of Serafina, not as a mother I never knew, but as a story whose ending had been whispered, not written. Sometimes I visited bookstores not to look for my name or the spine of our book, but to watch readers, their fingers hovering, their eyes pausing, their breath catching for reasons even they couldn't explain. That was where the manuscript lived now, not on pages, but in pauses, in the quiet syncopation between memory and meaning. We hadn't edited a text, we had re-edited a life, and in doing so, I had rewritten my own, not by adding chapters, but by learning which words to leave untouched, which truths to let rest where they always belonged, between the lines. The studio smelled of clay and burnt glaze, a scent I had grown used to but never stopped noticing, especially in moments of stillness when the past seemed to curl around the steam of tea beside me. I did not plan the final piece, nor sketch its lines. I simply sat before the wheel with hands open, not to mold something perfect, but to let something true take shape without resistance. The clay turned slowly, and as it turned, I let memory guide pressure, let silence dictate form, and allowed every invisible scar to find its curve. It was not symmetry I sought, nor elegance. I wanted something that could hold light without trying to shine, something that would not beg to be understood but simply be held. When the piece hardened, I did not smooth the ridges. I let them remain like echoes of every page, every breath, every unanswered question. It was a vessel, not for water, not for flowers, but for memory, suspended in form, with a glaze that shimmered unevenly, as if time had run its fingers along its edges and left behind a quiet signature of what once was. One afternoon, I placed it on the windowsill of our quiet kitchen, not to display, but to witness. Magnus saw it first, said nothing, but nodded once as if recognizing not the piece itself, but the story behind it, unspoken, unpolished, but undeniable in its presence. Solara placed a single sprig of rosemary inside, and the scent filled the room not with aroma, but with a kind of returning, as if the past had chosen to stay, gently, without reclaiming space or demanding to be understood. We never spoke of the manuscript again, not because it was buried, but because it had bloomed into something else, something more enduring than language and beyond the reach of questions. I began writing again, not for publication, but as a daily ritual, a tracing of breath across the paper, a promise to remember what does not insist on being remembered. My journals became mosaics of thought and texture, sometimes filled with silence that meant more than the words beside it, carrying the weight of all that remained unsaid. Evenings passed like gentle edits, light dimming at the corners, voices lower, but presence deeper with every page we turned. We read aloud again, not our own words, but those of others, poets, letter writers, voices once forgotten now reawakened in our living room. The air grew thick not with tension, but with listening, with the quiet kind of reverence reserved for things that nearly slipped away, but found a way back through voice and attention. I kept the rose necklace in a drawer, not locked, not displayed, just within reach, like a comma in a sentence still unfolding and never quite complete. Some days I wore it, other days I let it rest where it had always belonged. But always, I knew where it was, and that was enough. Its weight was not heavy, it was anchoring, a tether to the story that shaped me, not by defining me, but by reminding me what it meant to choose who to become. And so the house grew quieter, not emptier. The spaces between us expanded, not from distance, but from trust. Each of us learning to inhabit the silences we once feared and finding meaning not through explanation, but through coexistence. And, in those silences, we found rhythm, found continuity, found each other again, not as characters in a hidden narrative, but as co-authors of a life that no longer needed secrets to stay whole. The final work was never the vessel. It was the stillness it left behind, the quiet knowing that something had been seen, held, and let go, not with regret, but with grace and the soft echo of understanding.